Fire him, the vice president said without looking up from the stack of reports, and for a heartbeat the entire engineering conference room fell so quiet that even the distant hum of the test hangar seemed louder than anyone's breathing. No one argued. No one asked whether the decision made sense. They simply watched Nathan Brooks, a 41-year-old single father in a faded blue work shirt, gather his worn notebook, thank the room for the opportunity, and walk away with the same calm dignity he had carried through every setback life had placed before him. What none of them knew was that less than 10 minutes later the most advanced experimental jet the company had ever built would refuse to wake up for anyone except the man they had just replaced. Morning sunlight spilled across the massive Arizona flight test facility, painting silver reflections across polished aluminum and towering hangar doors as technicians hurried between tool carts, engineers stared into glowing monitors, and executives prepared for what was supposed to be the biggest demonstration in company history. The aircraft waiting on the runway represented nearly a decade of research and more than $2 billion in investment, while the newly assembled $40 million engineering task force stood proudly beside it, convinced that fresh ideas, expensive software, and prestigious resumes could solve anything. Nathan never looked back toward the conference room as he crossed the parking lot carrying nothing more than a small lunch box and the framed photograph of his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, smiling with 2 missing front teeth on the first day of 4th grade. Every morning she reminded him that being her dad mattered more than any title ever could, and every evening he promised himself he would never let disappointment follow him through the front door. His pickup truck waited beneath the desert sun, dusty from years of honest work, and he paused only long enough to place Lily's picture carefully on the passenger seat before starting the engine. Behind him, inside Hangar 3, dozens of specialists surrounded the jet like surgeons preparing for a complicated operation. Screens. Flash green. Diagnostic programs completed their cycles. Checklists were read aloud with polished confidence. One engineer nodded to another. "Everything looks perfect." Another smiled. "Let's make history." The lead operator pressed the ignition sequence. Nothing. He tried again. The cockpit remained silent. Another technician reset the software. Another replaced the sensor. Minutes slipped by. Confidence faded into confusion, and confusion quietly hardened into concern. Phones began ringing across the executive offices. Voices grew sharper. The polished certainty that had filled the hangar only moments before slowly dissolved beneath fluorescent lights that suddenly felt colder than before. Standing beside the runway, Claire Sullivan watched the motionless aircraft through the observation glass, her expression steady even as an uncomfortable thought entered her mind for the very first time. Somewhere beyond the security gate, the man they had dismissed was already driving home to pick up his daughter after school, completely unaware that the future of the entire program had just begun following him down the highway. Nathan Brooks reached Pine Ridge Elementary 20 minutes before the final bell, just as he had every weekday for the past 6 years. The afternoon sun stretched long golden shadows across the playground while children chased basketballs, laughed beside the swings, and raced toward the promise of another carefree evening. Nathan remained inside his aging pickup with the windows rolled halfway down, enjoying the warm desert breeze and the rare silence before the parking lot filled with excited voices. His cell phone rested face down on the seat beside Lily's photograph. It vibrated 3 different times. He did not reach for it. Whatever waited inside the aerospace facility could wait another hour. His daughter never should. Moments later, Lily burst through the front entrance wearing a faded backpack nearly as large as her shoulders. The instant she spotted the truck, her face brightened with the same smile that had carried Nathan through countless difficult mornings. She climbed inside, fastened her seat belt, and handed him a folded science quiz with a proud grin. 100% Dad. Nathan smiled warmly. "I knew you could do it." She laughed. "My teacher says I inherited your engineering brain." Nathan looked out through the windshield before quietly answering. "Your teacher gives me too much credit." The drive home followed familiar streets lined with small brick houses, neighborhood diners, and American flags fluttering gently from front porches. Their little home was modest, built decades earlier, but every inch of it carried memories carefully protected rather than expensive furniture carefully displayed. Inside the kitchen, Lily completed homework while Nathan prepared grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup using the same old saucepan that had belonged to his late wife. Their conversations drifted from school projects to weekend plans, from spelling tests to whether the backyard bird feeder needed more seed. Not once did Nathan mention losing his position that morning. He refused to let disappointment steal even one peaceful afternoon from his daughter. Across town, peace had disappeared completely. Engineers circled the silent aircraft with growing frustration. Fresh software updates produced identical failures. Replacement control modules changed nothing. Specialists from 3 different consulting firms debated sensor readings while expensive simulation models generated contradictory answers. Every passing minute increased financial losses measured not in hundreds or thousands, but in millions of dollars. Claire Sullivan stood quietly above the hangar floor behind the observation windows. She listened as confident voices slowly transformed into defensive explanations. One blamed electrical synchronization. Another insisted the problem originated inside the fuel management system. A third recommended postponing the demonstration entirely. None of them sounded certain anymore. An older maintenance supervisor named Frank Delaney watched the arguments from the edge of the hangar without speaking. After nearly 30 years around aircraft, he had learned that machines often revealed more about people than people realized. Finally, Claire approached him. "Do you have an opinion, Frank?" He looked toward the motionless jet before answering with a calm voice. "We keep asking computers what is wrong." Nathan always listened to the airplane first. Claire frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Frank folded his arms. "Some engineers study numbers. A few understand machines." Nathan understood both. "That is a rare difference." Claire remained silent long after Frank walked away. For the first time since approving the replacement, certainty no longer felt like leadership. It felt dangerously close to pride. The following morning the desert sky glowed pale orange as the first rays of sunlight reached the enormous glass walls of the aerospace complex. But inside Hangar 3 the atmosphere felt nothing like a new beginning. Coffee cups lined the conference table beside thick engineering reports, untouched breakfasts sat growing cold, and giant digital displays continued cycling through thousands of lines of diagnostic data that somehow answered every question except the one that mattered. Why would an aircraft that had passed every laboratory simulation refuse to come alive on the runway? Claire Sullivan had not gone home. Her neatly pressed blazer had given way to rolled sleeves, and the confidence that once defined every decision now rested beneath tired eyes searching for explanations that never arrived. Around her stood specialists recruited from the most respected engineering firms in the country. One had designed propulsion systems for commercial airliners. Another specialized in advanced software integration. A third had built an impressive reputation developing artificial intelligence for predictive maintenance. Individually, they were brilliant. Together, they represented nearly $40 million in consulting contracts. Yet hour after hour, the aircraft remained silent. One engineer cleared his throat. "The software logs are clean." Another pointed toward a large monitor. "Fuel pressure remains within acceptable limits." A third folded his arms. "We should replace the entire ignition control assembly." Frank Delaney quietly watched the discussion from the back of the room. Nobody asked for his opinion this time, and he seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Experience had taught him that panic usually became louder just before wisdom became quieter. Outside the conference room, technicians removed panels, inspected wiring harnesses, recalibrated sensors, and replaced perfectly functioning components simply because they had run out of new ideas. Every adjustment produced the same disappointing result. The engine acknowledged the command sequence, paused for several long seconds, and returned to silence. The enormous hangar echoed with nothing except cooling fans and disappointed sighs. Hundreds of feet away, Nathan Brooks was doing something infinitely less impressive. He was replacing the worn brakes on an elderly neighbor's pickup truck in exchange for homemade peach pie and enough money to cover Lily's upcoming school field trip. He worked slowly, humming an old country tune beneath his breath while Lily sat nearby reading a library book and occasionally handing him the correct wrench before he even asked. "You always know which tool I need," Nathan said with a smile. Lily shrugged playfully. "Maybe I inherited your engineering brain after all." Nathan laughed softly and tightened the final bolt. "Or maybe you just pay attention. That matters even more." Back inside the aerospace facility, another emergency meeting came to order. The financial officer projected new numbers across the screen. Every delayed day would cost millions. A government evaluation flight had already been postponed. Investors wanted answers. Reporters had begun calling. The vice president who had approved Nathan's dismissal rubbed his forehead before speaking. "We assembled the best engineering team money could buy. Why are we still standing still?" Nobody answered. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected. Finally, Frank looked toward the dark observation window reflecting everyone's anxious faces and spoke with calm certainty. "You hired brilliant people. But brilliance is not the same as understanding. Machines remember the hands that built trust with them. Some knowledge never makes it into manuals." Claire lowered her eyes toward the polished conference table. Somewhere beyond those walls, a humble single father was living an ordinary day, completely unaware that the company had begun discovering the true cost of replacing quiet wisdom with expensive confidence. By the fourth morning, the flight test facility no longer sounded like a place where history was about to be made. The cheerful conversations that usually echoed across the polished hangar floor had been replaced by quiet footsteps, whispered meetings, and the constant tapping of keyboards searching for answers that refused to appear. Every diagnostic screen glowed with reassuring green indicators, yet the aircraft remained stubbornly silent, as though it knew something every computer in the building had somehow forgotten. Claire Sullivan stood beside the observation window with a fresh cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She watched another team install replacement components that had arrived overnight on a charter flight from Texas. The shipment alone had cost more than Nathan Brooks earned in several years, and still nobody could explain why each expensive solution ended exactly where the previous one had failed. A young systems engineer named Daniel Mercer hesitated outside the conference room before finally gathering enough courage to knock gently on the open door. Claire looked up from another stack of technical reports. Daniel rarely interrupted executive meetings, which made his nervous expression impossible to ignore. He stepped inside and carefully placed a weathered maintenance binder on the table. "I found something in the archived records," he said quietly. Claire raised an eyebrow. "What kind of records?" Daniel opened the binder to a series of handwritten inspection notes that looked strangely out of place beside the company's polished digital documents. Every page carried the same careful handwriting. Every observation described not only measurements but sounds, vibrations, temperatures, and even subtle changes in the engine during startup. Claire studied the pages. "Who wrote these?" Daniel swallowed before answering. "Nathan Brooks." The room became noticeably quieter. One executive leaned back in his chair. "We digitized all of that years ago." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Not everything. Some of these notes were never entered into the database because they were considered personal observations instead of measurable data." Frank Delaney smiled faintly from the corner of the room. "Personal observations," he repeated softly. "That was always the difference." Claire continued reading. Nathan had documented tiny patterns no software could easily classify. A slight whistle during cold mornings. A delayed vibration after long storage. The faint scent of warm insulation before a pressure imbalance appeared. None of the entries sounded dramatic, yet together they painted the picture of someone who knew the aircraft as if it were an old friend instead of a complicated machine. Hundreds of miles away from corporate meetings and mounting pressure, Nathan spent the afternoon helping Lily build a small model airplane for her science class. They spread cardboard, glue, rulers, and colored pencils across the kitchen table while soft country music played from an old radio resting on the windowsill. Lily carefully adjusted one wing and frowned. "It keeps leaning to one side." Nathan smiled without reaching for it. "What do you think it is trying to tell you?" She looked closer instead of forcing the pieces together. After a moment her face brightened. The balance is wrong. Nathan nodded with quiet pride. Machines cannot speak with words, sweetheart. They speak with patterns. If you pay attention long enough, they usually tell you exactly what they need. At nearly the same moment, Claire closed Nathan's maintenance binder and stared through the conference room window toward the silent aircraft. For the first time since this crisis had begun, she stopped asking what was wrong with the engine and started wondering whether they had dismissed the only person who had ever truly learned how to listen. Late that evening, the lights inside Hangar 3 still burned against the dark Arizona sky, casting long reflections across the polished concrete floor where exhausted engineers moved more slowly than they had only a few days earlier. Confidence had disappeared completely. Every fresh theory had collapsed beneath another failed startup sequence, and every expensive solution had quietly joined the growing list of disappointments. Claire Sullivan stood alone beside the motionless aircraft after everyone else drifted back toward the conference rooms. She rested one hand lightly against the cool aluminum skin and closed her eyes for a moment, listening not to the machine but to the silence surrounding it. Frank Delaney approached without hurry, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Claire before speaking. Sometimes the hardest part of leadership is admitting that the answer walked out the front gate before we realized we needed it. Claire looked toward the empty runway stretching into the darkness. I replaced one man with an entire engineering task force. Frank nodded gently. You replaced experience with credentials. Those are not always the same thing. Claire lowered her eyes. I thought I was protecting the program. Frank smiled kindly. Then protect it now. Pride has never repaired an airplane. His words lingered long after he walked away. Claire returned to her office and opened Nathan Brooks's personnel file for the first time since approving his dismissal. She expected performance reviews and project summaries. Instead, she found years of quiet excellence. Letters from test pilots praising his calm judgment. Maintenance crews thanking him for staying late without claiming overtime. Young engineers describing how patiently he had taught them without making anyone feel small. There were no awards displayed in glossy brochures, no self-promotion, no speeches claiming credit. There was only a consistent pattern of humility, competence, and trust. Claire leaned back in her chair, realizing she knew almost nothing about the man whose signature appeared throughout the history of the program. Across town, Nathan finished washing the dinner dishes while Lily packed her backpack for school. She looked up from the kitchen table. Dad, are you going back to the airplane place tomorrow? Nathan smiled softly while drying a plate. I honestly do not know, sweetheart. She tilted her head. Do you miss it? He thought carefully before answering. I miss the people. I miss solving problems. But no job is worth losing your peace. Lily nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. A few minutes later, Nathan tucked her into bed, read one chapter from her favorite adventure novel, switched off the bedroom light, and quietly closed the door. His telephone began ringing almost immediately afterward. He glanced at the unfamiliar number before answering with his usual calm voice. Nathan Brooks speaking. Several seconds passed before Claire finally found the words. Nathan, this is Claire Sullivan. I know it is late, and I understand if you do not wish to speak with me. He remained silent, giving her room to continue. She took a slow breath. We have tried everything. Every specialist. Every simulation. Every recommendation. Nothing has worked. Nathan walked toward the living room window and looked out at the quiet neighborhood resting beneath the stars. When he finally spoke, his question was simple, almost surprisingly so. Has anyone broken the original factory seals on the primary startup valve? Claire looked down at the engineering reports scattered across her desk. No one in the room knew the answer. For the first time in 4 exhausting days, the silence carried something different. It carried hope. The next morning, Nathan Brooks arrived at the aerospace facility before sunrise, not because anyone demanded it, but because he had promised Lily he would still be home in time to help her finish her history project after dinner. His old pickup rolled quietly through the security gate, while employees paused to watch from sidewalks and parking lots. Some lowered their eyes, remembering the meeting only a few days earlier. Others exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they were witnessing the return of a former employee or the arrival of the only remaining hope. Nathan stepped out carrying the same worn notebook he had taken home after his dismissal. He wore the same faded blue work shirt, the same work boots polished only by years of honest labor, and the same calm expression that revealed neither resentment nor triumph. Claire Sullivan met him outside Hangar 3. For a brief moment she searched for the perfect apology, but Nathan offered a gentle nod before she could speak. "Good morning, Claire," she answered quietly. "Thank you for coming back." Nathan smiled politely. "You said the airplane needed help. That is enough for today." Together they walked across the enormous hangar where dozens of engineers stood waiting in complete silence. No presentations appeared on the large monitors. No consultant rushed forward with another theory. Even Frank Delaney quietly stepped aside, allowing Nathan an unobstructed path toward the aircraft. Nathan did not ask for engineering reports. He did not request simulation data. He did not even glance at the diagnostic screens that had dominated every discussion for the past 4 days. Instead, he slowly circled the aircraft, one careful step at a time, occasionally resting his fingertips against the smooth aluminum skin as though greeting an old friend after a long absence. He paused beneath the left intake, closed his eyes, and listened. The hangar became so still that people could hear distant air conditioning units humming high above the ceiling. Nathan inhaled slowly, then walked toward the rear access panel. He crouched beside the primary startup valve without saying a word. After nearly a full minute, he finally looked toward Claire. "Has anyone removed the original factory seal?" Claire answered honestly. "No. We followed every preservation procedure exactly." Nathan nodded once. "Good. Then the airplane has been trying to tell you something." Several engineers leaned closer without interrupting. Nathan pointed toward a small pressure balancing valve hidden behind a protective bracket that most people in the room had barely noticed. "Please rotate this exactly 7 degrees clockwise. No more. No less." One young technician hesitated. "That adjustment is almost too small to measure." Nathan smiled gently. "The airplane will measure it for us." The technician carefully made the tiny adjustment, while every pair of eyes remained fixed on his hands. Nathan stepped back and folded his arms. "Try the startup sequence now." The lead operator pressed the ignition control. 1 second passed. Then another. A low mechanical whir echoed softly through the hangar. Turbine blades began turning with smooth confidence. Fuel ignited cleanly. A bright stream of controlled exhaust shimmered behind the aircraft as the engine climbed steadily through every power setting exactly as it had been designed to do years before. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. Dozens of brilliant engineers simply stood frozen beneath the growing sound of the living engine, their earlier certainty replaced by quiet respect. Claire looked at Nathan with disbelief in her eyes. "You solved 4 days of failure in less than 5 minutes. Nathan watched the steady engine instruments without the slightest trace of pride. Then he answered with the same calm voice he had used all week. "Sometimes the smallest correction only becomes visible after someone remembers how to listen." The steady roar of the engine filled Hangar 3 with a sound that many people had begun to believe they would never hear again. Warm air rolled across the polished concrete floor while the turbine settled into a smooth rhythm that every experienced technician recognized immediately. It was healthy. It was balanced. It was exactly the sound the aircraft had been designed to produce. Yet no one rushed to celebrate. The silence that followed carried far more weight than applause ever could. Engineers who had spent 4 exhausting days surrounded by advanced software and expensive equipment simply stared at Nathan Brooks with expressions that blended surprise, humility, and growing respect. Claire Sullivan slowly approached the instrument panel, carefully studying every reading. Fuel pressure remained stable. Oil temperature climbed exactly as expected. Vibration levels rested comfortably inside the safest operating range. Every indicator that had refused to cooperate for nearly a week now behaved as though nothing had ever been wrong. She turned toward Nathan. "I still do not understand how you knew where to look." Nathan glanced once more toward the quietly humming engine before answering. I did not begin by looking. I began by listening. Claire frowned thoughtfully. Listening to what? Nathan rested one hand lightly against the side of the aircraft. Every machine has a personality. Most people hear noise. Over time you begin hearing patterns instead. When those patterns change, the machine is already telling you where to start. Around them, conversations quietly resumed. Young engineers gathered around the maintenance binder Daniel Mercer had discovered, comparing Nathan's handwritten notes with the live telemetry now appearing across their monitors. For the first time they realized those pages had never been old-fashioned habits. They had been years of disciplined observation recorded with extraordinary care. Daniel looked at Frank Delaney and shook his head in disbelief. We spent millions collecting data. He gathered wisdom one day at a time. Frank smiled gently. Data answers questions. Wisdom teaches you which question to ask first. While technicians completed final inspections before another startup verification, Claire returned to her office determined to understand the man standing inside her hangar. She requested archived project files dating back more than a decade, including records that had never been digitized after several company mergers. Thick folders soon covered her desk. Promotion recommendations, internal design reviews, test flight evaluations. The deeper she searched, the more one name quietly appeared throughout the history of the entire propulsion program. Nathan Brooks. Sometimes his name appeared as lead systems engineer. Sometimes it appeared only inside handwritten technical comments buried deep within hundreds of pages. Yet experienced pilots repeatedly praised the same qualities. Calm judgment. Exceptional diagnostic instincts. Absolute honesty. Quiet leadership. Claire continued reading until one particular document caused her to stop breathing for a brief moment. It was the original engineering approval package for the aircraft's startup architecture, signed 12 years earlier by the chief propulsion team. Most signatures belonged to executives who had since retired. Near the bottom appeared Nathan's signature beside a simple description that changed everything. Primary Startup Sequence Development Lead. Claire looked back toward the observation window where Nathan was patiently answering questions from younger engineers without seeking recognition or praise. The realization settled over her with astonishing clarity. The man everyone had viewed as an ordinary maintenance specialist had never simply maintained the airplane. He had helped create the very heartbeat that brought it to life, and somewhere along the years of reorganizations, promotions, and forgotten history, the company had erased the memory of the engineer while unknowingly depending on the wisdom he had quietly left behind. That afternoon the atmosphere inside the executive conference room felt completely different from the confidence that had filled it only a week earlier. Nobody spoke about consulting contracts or expensive software anymore. Instead, every conversation revolved around a single question that no one had thought to ask before. Who was Nathan Brooks before he quietly disappeared into the background? Claire Sullivan placed another worn archive box onto the conference table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were engineering journals, handwritten calculations, early design sketches, and faded photographs from the original propulsion development program. Frank Delaney stood beside her without saying a word while several younger engineers gathered around with growing curiosity. Claire slowly unfolded one yellowed blueprint and immediately recognized the familiar handwriting that had filled the maintenance binder. Every margin contained careful notes explaining why certain startup tolerances had been chosen, why one valve required an exact position instead of a wider range, and why listening during the first few seconds of ignition often revealed problems long before electronic sensors detected them. Daniel Mercer quietly shook his head. We have been following his work for years without realizing whose work it was. Claire continued searching until she discovered a sealed personnel memorandum dated 12 years earlier. She read the first page silently, then continued more slowly as the room became completely still. During the final development phase of the propulsion system, a software synchronization error threatened to delay the entire government certification program. Nathan Brooks identified the problem, developed the correction, supervised the overnight validation tests, and volunteered to Accept responsibility for a documentation oversight committed by a newly hired engineer who feared losing his career. The project stayed on schedule. The young engineer remained employed. Nathan received no public recognition because the official report credited the entire department instead of one individual. Claire lowered the document and looked toward Frank. Why did nobody ever tell this story? Frank smiled sadly. Because Nathan asked us not to. He always believed protecting people mattered more than protecting his reputation. The room fell silent once again. Every engineer understood what that meant. A man had quietly surrendered personal recognition so someone else could keep a future. Years later, the organization had remembered the project but forgotten the character behind it. Meanwhile, Nathan sat outside on a simple wooden bench near the flight line, eating a homemade turkey sandwich while watching technicians prepare the aircraft for another successful engine test. Several younger engineers approached with notebooks in their hands, asking thoughtful questions instead of offering opinions. Nathan answered each one patiently, never making anyone feel inexperienced or embarrassed. Before leaving, Daniel hesitated for a moment. "Mr. Brooks, why did you never tell us you designed the startup sequence?" Nathan smiled warmly. "Because airplanes do not care whose name is on the drawing. They only care whether someone built them with honesty." Daniel looked down thoughtfully before asking one final question. "Then why did you come back after everything that happened?" Nathan folded the empty sandwich wrapper and placed it neatly inside his lunch box. "Because walking away would have been easier for me, but it would not have been better for everyone else. Real engineering is not about proving that you are right. It is about making sure people return home safely." As Daniel quietly walked back toward the hangar, Claire watched the conversation from across the ramp. For the first time, she fully understood that the company's greatest asset had never been hidden inside a laboratory, a computer model, or a multi-million-dollar contract. It had been sitting quietly in a modest pickup truck every morning, carrying a lunchbox, a photograph of his daughter, and a character that no balance sheet had ever learned how to measure. 3 days later, the Arizona sky stretched wide and brilliantly clear above the flight test center as employees lined the observation deck overlooking the runway. Reporters waited behind designated barriers, government representatives filled the viewing area, and engineers stood shoulder to shoulder without speaking much at all. There was no tension now, only anticipation wrapped in quiet respect. The aircraft rested at the end of the runway with its polished surface reflecting the morning sun, ready for the evaluation flight that had nearly been cancelled forever. Nathan Brooks arrived early, just as he always had, carrying the same worn lunchbox and wearing the same faded blue work shirt that had become more recognizable than any expensive business suit in the company. Beside him walked Lily, proudly holding his hand while looking up at the enormous aircraft with wide eyes. Claire Sullivan met them near the hangar entrance. This time there were no conference tables, no hurried meetings, and no executives speaking over one another. She simply extended her hand. "Nathan, before today begins, there is something I need to say." Nathan smiled gently and shook her hand. Claire continued with complete sincerity. "I judged your value by your position instead of your character. I confused visibility with importance. I was wrong." Nathan nodded kindly without making her discomfort any greater. "The strongest teams are not built by people who never make mistakes. They are built by people willing to learn from them." Claire handed him a folder containing a formal offer that restored his previous position with a substantial promotion, expanded authority, and a compensation package that reflected everything the company had overlooked for years. Nathan read only the first page before quietly closing the folder. Claire looked surprised. "You are not going to read the rest?" Nathan smiled. "I appreciate your generosity, but before I answer, I have one request." She nodded immediately. "Anything." Nathan looked toward the young engineers gathering beside the aircraft. "Create a mentorship program. Pair every experienced engineer with someone just beginning their career. Teach them that listening matters as much as knowledge. Reward humility as much as intelligence. Never allow another person with good ideas to become invisible because they are quiet." Claire felt her eyes grow warm. "You have my word." Moments later, the chief test pilot climbed into the cockpit while ground crews completed the final inspection. The startup command echoed across the runway. Instantly, the engine came alive with the same smooth confidence everyone had heard inside the hangar only days before. This time, the sound carried something deeper than technical success. It carried redemption. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted gracefully into the bright blue sky, applause spread naturally through the crowd. Engineers smiled at one another. Frank Delaney quietly removed his cap. Daniel Mercer looked toward Nathan with admiration that would shape the rest of his career. A few moments later, the pilot's calm voice came across the radio for everyone to hear. Flight systems are performing flawlessly. Please extend my thanks to the engineer who taught this airplane how to breathe. Every head turned toward Nathan. He did not raise his hands. He did not seek recognition. He simply looked at Lily. She squeezed his hand tightly and whispered, "I always knew you could fix it, Dad." Nathan smiled with quiet gratitude. That was the only recognition he had ever truly needed. As the aircraft disappeared into the endless American sky, the people standing along the runway finally understood a lesson no budget, title, or prestigious resume could ever guarantee. Extraordinary talent may build remarkable machines, but quiet character is what keeps them worthy of trust, and sometimes the greatest person in the room is the one who never feels the need to remind anyone who he is.